Right, here we go. Welcome back, everyone. We'll just wait for everyone to arrive. Thank you so much for coming again. So I think most of you here probably did come yesterday. So today's lesson, we are going to have a look at inheritance. So lots of look at Punnett squares, inherited disorders, and that sort of thing. I'll go through all of the learning objectives and everything in a moment. Okay, let's get this page up. Right, so yesterday, if you remember, we had a look at reproduction and the genome. So we looked at mitosis and meiosis, we had a look at sexual and asexual reproduction, and then we also looked at the structure of DNA and a little bit about the importance of the genome. So following on from that then, we're going to have a look at genetic inheritance today. So part 2 in this course. So these are our learning outcomes for the session. So hopefully by the end, you'll be able to explain all these different terms. So we've got gamete, allele, dominant, recessive, homozygous, heterozygous, genotype and phenotype. You should be able to construct a genetic cross, and we're going to have a look at doing a Punnett square diagram. We're going to have a look at two inherited disorders, which are going to be cystic fibrosis and polydactyly. And then finally, we can have a brief look at embryonic screening. So just the same as last time, this is still going to be for the AQA exam board, but obviously it's very similar for most exam boards at GCSE level. Okay, so, and just to don't forget as well, obviously interact with me via the chat. So I'm going to be asking you questions, lots of activities throughout, and hopefully you can chat to me via that. And then at the end, we will be doing a Kahoot quiz to see how much you've remembered. So let's get started then. So I have some terms here and some definitions. So what I would like you to help me do is to help match up these key terms to the correct definitions. So let's start off with genotype then. Who can tell me? In fact, it'll be easier if I say the definition and you tell me which one the key term is. So let's start with an easier one. The alleles present. Can anyone tell me what the alleles present are? What would that be defined as? Or even what an allele is? Okay, so the alleles present can't be the term allele because it's got that in the name. But yeah, so I can see a few of you now saying an allele is a different form of a gene. So this is probably the most important thing that I'm going to need you to understand today is what actually is an allele. So we saw from last time we had a look at genes. Can anyone remind me what a gene is? So gene is a section of DNA. Remember, DNA is found in chromosomes, and it controls a characteristic. And we actually say that genes code for proteins. Well remembered, and those of you who are saying that in the chat. Brilliant. Okay, so an allele is just a version of that gene. So for example, we had a gene that would control eye color, and we might have one that gives us blue eyes, brown eyes, and green eyes, or whatever. Okay, so what about, so we've got an allele. So the alleles present, I can tell you that would be genotype. Okay, so genotype, so genes, alleles, the same sort of thing. Genotype is effectively, we can't say that it's the genes that we have because, you know, all humans, we all have the same genes, right? Because we have to have a gene that controls eye color, a gene that controls this, that, and whatever. But we have different versions of those genes. So it's what are the alleles present? So you might have heard it represented something like big B, little b. You might have seen this before. And by the way, I'm interested, have you guys here, have you actually covered this topic in school yet? Or is this new to you, these terms? So obviously the pace at which we go is going to depend on how familiar you are with the topic already. Okay, right, so genotype is the alleles that we have present. So for a particular gene, so those alleles might be dominant or recessive. So a dominant allele is an allele that's always expressed even if we have one copy present. Now, what we mean by expressed is we mean that it's always shown in our characteristics. So say, for example, I might have inherited the allele of my gene for eye colour. I might have inherited the allele for brown eyes from my dad and the allele for blue eyes from my mum. But if the allele for brown eyes is dominant, then I would have brown eyes. Okay. So yeah, so dominant allele is always expressed even if we only have one copy present. And when I say one copy present, remember we have 2 copies of each gene because we have one from each parent. So that leaves us then, what would a recessive allele be, do we think? So if a dominant allele is always expressed if only one copy is present, it's dominant. And a recessive allele would be something that is only expressed if 2 copies are present. In other words, a recessive allele is only expressed if we don't have a dominant allele there. Okay, so if you're going to write down any of these definitions, obviously you're going to need to know all of these definitions, but particularly for today, what we're doing with the genetic diagrams is going to be really important that you know allele, dominant allele, and recessive allele. Okay, so then we've got, what do we think phenotype is? So if a genotype is the alleles present or the versions of those genes that are present, what would a phenotype be? Okay, so a phenotype is the characteristic expressed by the alleles present. Well done, those of you who've just sent that in the chat. Okay, so what else have we got left? So we've got gamete. So gamete is just this one at the bottom. Gamete is just a sex cell. They contain a single set of chromosomes. So that links to what we did last lesson. So when we had a look at meiosis, we saw that gametes are made from meiosis. Okay, and then we've got homozygous and heterozygous. So I'll give you a moment to work out which is which. And if you can send that to me in the chat. Okay, well done, those of you who've got that. So homo means same and hetero means different. So homozygous is where we have 2 copies of the same allele for a gene, and heterozygous is where we have 2 different alleles for a gene. Okay then, so let's go on to the next part. So hopefully that's made sense, those definitions. We'll see what those are like in practice now. Okay then, so we've got a chromosome and we've got a pair of chromosomes. So in our cells, it would be one from each parent, one from mum and one from dad. So we've got on this chromosome, remember chromosome is made of DNA and it contains our genes, which are small sections of DNA. So we can see here that we've got different genes in different colours. So we've got, so here this might be the gene's pink one, this might be the gene for eye colour, for example, and this one here, this might be the gene for, I don't know, hair colour. Obviously, it's a bit more complex than that when it comes down to it, because it's more complex than just, you know, one gene coding for one specific characteristic, but that's something that we're going to have a look at next lesson. Okay, so we can see these. I can see we've got a question. When people dye their hair, do they alter chromosomes? No, they don't. So you can't actually take away from what your genotype, from what your chromosomes are. So we'll be changing how we physically look. We'll be changing our characteristics, but we wouldn't actually be changing our genes. Okay, so we can see here that these in different colours, because they're at the same position on the chromosome, these are the same gene, but they're different versions of that gene, and I've represented those by different colours. So these would be different alleles. Okay. So a few of you are asking me to go back to this slide, so I'll just go back to this for a minute. So I can see we've got a few questions so far. So if you've got any questions on what we've had a look at so far, send them in the chat now. So I can see a few of you are asking about things like personality traits and other different characteristics that we have. So as I was saying, a gene codes for a protein, but characteristics are due to an interaction of lots of different proteins. So even for eye color, I mean, using the basic example of one gene gives us brown eyes and a different allele of that gene gives us blue eyes, but it's much more complex than that. And will this come up in your exams? I mean, yeah, potentially it's a topic that can come up on your exams, definitely, and these definitions are certainly really, really important that you remember them. The best way to remember them, I would say, is breaking the words down and actually thinking about what they mean and sort of, you know, associating them with other things. So for example, I mean, dominant and recessive, if you someone who's dominant, they are, you know, domineering, they are the one that's sort of in control. A dominant allele is in control, right? It's the one that's always going to determine that characteristic depending on whether there's a recessive allele present or not. I can see, what year will you learn this? Probably year 10 or 11. But it depends on which school you go to. Okay, so again, a different way to represent this dominant and recessive allele thing. So we've got, so this is one person with 2 copies of a chromosome, one from mum, one from dad, and we would say that they are heterozygous because they've got 1 copy of a dominant allele and 1 copy of a recessive allele. Okay, so they've got different alleles. Whereas this person here, this person is homozygous because they've got 2 copies of the same allele, and this person is also homozygous, meant to say individual C, because they've got 2 copies of the same allele again, but you'll notice that their genotypes are different, okay? So if we had the allele for brown eyes was dominant, we normally represent dominant alleles as a capital letter, and we normally represent recessive alleles as a lowercase letter. So what do we think individual A would be? What would their genotype be? So individual A genotype, well done those of you who have just sent that in the chat. So they would be big B, little b, because they are heterozygous. Individual B, they're homozygous for brown eyes, so we can see that they would have 2 big Bs. And individual C is homozygous for blue eyes, so they would have 2 little b's. Oh, it didn't draw that very well. Okay, I'm just going to have a look at some questions that we've got in the chat. So we've got, so say you have 2 different recessive alleles for eye colour, would you have no eye colour? There's always a dominant one. It's all a hierarchy. So there's always one that is more dominant than the other. So for example, brown eyes would be more dominant than blue eyes, which would be more dominant than green eyes and grey eyes or whatever. But that's not something we really look at GCSE level. At GCSE level, we just sort of imagine that for every gene there's two versions of that, one dominant and one recessive, when actually the picture of that is much more complex in real life. Yeah, so this is what Punnett squares are used for, to organise the outcome of different alleles. Yet we're going to have a look at how that works in a moment. Okay, let's just have a read of the rest of these messages. Why is the first one big B, little b, and not the other way around? It doesn't matter. We tend to put the capital letter first. It's just something that we do. But obviously, it would actually be this one would be little b, and this one would be big B. But we just write it as big B, little b. So the lowercase one represents a recessive allele, and the uppercase one represents a dominant allele. if both your parents have brown eyes, is it possible to get a different eye colour? Yes, it is. If both of them, because both parents could have brown eyes and they could have the dominant allele for brown eyes, and they could still have the recessive allele for blue eyes. And when it comes together, that could still mean that if their children were to inherit a recessive allele from mum, a recessive allele from dad for blue eyes, and they would have blue eyes. Okay, I will answer the rest of these questions at the end. So, right, so this is just what we've talked through. So this is how we represent alleles. If you want to write this down. So dominant allele is always a capital letter and recessive allele is always a corresponding smaller letter. And we call that allele pair, the alleles present, the genotype. So let's have a go at this question then. So if one parent has brown eyes and one parent has blue eyes, they're both homozygous. So what would their genotypes be? So one parent with brown eyes, genotypes. So remember, homo means the same. So if one parent has brown eyes, they're going to have big B, okay, because they're homozygous. We know they must have at least one big B because they've got brown eyes and brown eyes is dominant, but we know that would be, there would be another big B as well because they've got two of the same one. Okay, and then we have the allele, so parent with blue eyes, so they must have two little b's. Okay, so the key there is in that homozygous, homo meaning same. Okay, so what genes are present in the gametes? So who can remind me what a gamete is and how does that link to meiosis? Okay, good. So a gamete is a sex cell. So for example, a sperm or an egg. And they have a single set of chromosomes from meiosis, because remember, meiosis has two divisions and it creates haploid cells with half numbers of chromosomes. In other words, single set of chromosomes. So if our normal cells have 46 chromosomes, then our gametes would have 23. So they're now not paired, which means that our gametes would have one copy of each chromosome. Okay, so the gametes, so the genes that would be present in the gametes here then, so they could either be, so in this person, they could only create gametes with either a big B in them, and this person could only create gametes with a little b in them. Whereas if they were heterozygous, if they were big B, little b, half of their gametes would have this dominant allele and half of the gametes would have this recessive allele. We've got a question, why isn't the first one big B, little b? The parent with brown eyes, well, brown eyes could be big B, or it could be big B, little b. The reason we know it's two big Bs is because it's homozygous, meaning we have two of the same copy. Okay, so what are the possible genotypes of the offspring from this cross? So this is where we have to look at how we perform a genetic cross, which is called a Punnet square. So what we do here is, so we work out what the gametes can be. So this one, the gametes can only be big B, and this one, they can only be little b. So we draw it out like this, and we can see, so what we do is, so we draw two lines like this, and we put mums on the top and dads on the bottom. It doesn't matter which way round you do it. So we draw those possible combination of gametes here, we draw the possible combination here, and we can see all of their offspring would then have big B, little b. So we would say that all of their offspring are heterozygous, and we can work out that the phenotype, what we actually see that to be, that would be 100% of those offspring would have brown eyes. Okay. So if we go back to our learning objectives at the start, hopefully then you can explain these terms gamete, allele, dominant, recessive, homozygous, heterozygous, genotype, and phenotype. So remember, gametes are our sex cells, alleles is a different version of a gene. The dominant one is always expressed. The recessive one is only expressed if the dominant one isn't present. In other words, you have to have 2 copies present. Homo means same, hetero means different. Genotype is the alleles that we have, and phenotype is the way that that's expressed, so the characteristic that we see. Okay, and we've also started having a look at how to construct a genetic cross by a Punnet square diagram, but don't worry, we are going to have a look at more examples of that. We're also going to now have a look at some inherited disorders before we go on to some more examples. I see someone's asked what time will we do a Kahoot. I reckon we'll probably do the Kahoot about 15 minutes before the end, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, so I'm going to just, I know a few of you are asking me to go back to this slide, so I'm going to leave this up for just 30 seconds in case you missed anything. And then we will go on to the inherited disorders. And I'll answer any questions in the meantime. What is meant by X, Y, and XX chromosomes? So they are just different types of chromosomes which can code for our characteristics associated with sex. So that's something that we're going to have a look at after. Recessive, yeah, recessive is always a lowercase letter, but it could be a different letter. So we normally do the letter based on the characteristics. So if we're talking about cystic fibrosis, we'd normally use the letter C just to represent cystic fibrosis, but it doesn't really matter which letter you use. So capital B, that would mean a dominant allele. If you were born without eyes, what would happen to the chromosomes? You still have the chromosomes there. It would just mean that there's another gene that was to mean that you didn't have eyes. What would the exam questions look like on this topic? We are going to have a look at some exam questions. So don't worry about that for now. They tend to just be asking you to define these terms, and normally for 1 or 2 marks, and also tends to be like getting you to draw this Punnet square. So we'll have a go at some exam questions more towards the end once we've looked at these inherited disorders. Okay, so what is an inherited disorder? So an inherited disorder is any sort of disease that we can inherit, right? So it's in our genetics. So there are lots and lots of disorders that would be inherited, and some of them are like 100% inherited. Some of them there is a genetic component to them, but there is also a component of what's in our environment. We're going to look at ones that are completely genetic, and the examples that we're going to look at are cystic fibrosis and also polydactyly. Now, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about these disorders because it's something that in class you might go into a little bit more detail on, but actually for your exam, having looked at all the different exam questions that are present, you see that all you really need to know is whether the disorder is caused by a dominant and recessive allele, and a little bit about what that disorder is. Okay, so our first one then, cystic fibrosis. So you might have heard of cystic fibrosis, you might know a little bit about what it is. Cystic fibrosis is caused by a recessive allele. So there is a gene that controls the development of cystic fibrosis. Now, most people on that gene, they have a dominant allele, they're okay. They have normal cell membranes. Remember, cell membranes is what's found around the outside of the cell. And they have normal mucus in their body. So in like the windpipe and the trachea and whatever. However, someone with cystic fibrosis has what we call a mutation, a different version of that gene, which so is there for a different allele. And that allele is recessive. Okay, it means that actually it's quite difficult to get this disorder. It means that we would need both of our copies, both copies of that gene needs to have the faulty version of this gene for cystic fibrosis, which means you have to inherit it from both your mum and your dad. So cystic fibrosis is a disorder of the cell membranes, and it causes thick mucus. and that causes problems in breathing and difficulty in our digestion. I have seen a 3-mark question before asking what cystic fibrosis is. You get 1 mark for saying that it's a disorder of the cell membranes, 1 mark for saying that that results in thick mucus building up, and another mark for saying what that affects, whether that affects breathing because we block our trachea, or it also affects digestion because we block some of our glands. Okay, so the most important thing though that I want you to remember out of this slide is that cystic fibrosis is caused by a recessive allele. So this means that, so let's say your mum didn't have cystic fibrosis, so she had 1 dominant allele and she had 1 recessive allele. This means that she is a carrier. She carries that, she doesn't actually present as having cystic fibrosis. Now let's say that your dad wasn't a carrier. So your dad just had 2 normal copies present. If we were to combine those in a genetic cross, so the gametes of this one could either, half of mum's gametes could be big C, half of them could be little c, and all of them in this one would be big C. So let's draw that in a cross. So we're going to draw mum's gametes on the top. So we're going to draw big C, little c, and dad's gametes on the bottom, big C, big C. Combine them together, 2 big C's, big C, little c, 2 big C's, big C, little c. Do any of these offspring, any of these children have cystic fibrosis? Can anyone tell me? No, exactly, because these 2 here, half of them, 50%, would be carriers, but they don't actually have it, because remember, for a recessive allele to actually, for that to present in the phenotype, for that to present as a characteristic, you have to have 2 copies present. So let's take another example then. Let's say mum is a carrier, big C, little c, and dad is also a carrier. Neither of them have cystic fibrosis. Again, we do the same thing. We draw that in a Punnet square. We draw a big C, little c, big C, little c. How many, what percentage of their offspring do you think are going to have cystic fibrosis? Can you predict it before I've got there? So you've got 2 big C's, big C, little c, big C, little c, little c, little c. Well done, everyone who said 25%, okay? So it's just these ones here would have cystic fibrosis. These 2 would be carriers, so 50% would be carriers, 25% wouldn't be affected at all. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at a different type of inherited disorder. We're going to have a look at polydactyly. So polydactyly is where we have extra fingers or toes. That's all you need to know about it. And it's caused by a dominant allele. So do we think if your parent had polydactyly, are you definitely going to get it? No, good, because we might, let's say mum had polydactyly and dad didn't. Mum might have, so if we called polydactyly P, so big P to have it, little p to not have it, okay? And let's say dad was 2 lowercase ones. Those of you who are asking me to go back to the slides, remember this is all recorded and we will send you a link to it after. So don't worry if you're missing something, you can just go back to it and rewatch that part of the recording, okay? Okay, so polydactyly then. So let's say mum had it. We wouldn't necessarily get this one. We might inherit this one from mum and this one from dad, in which case we wouldn't have it. Okay, so the main thing I want you to remember here is that polydactyly is caused by a dominant allele, okay? Now, I'm going to have a little look at embryo screening, but I'm not going to spend too long on it. It's something that I'd like you to have a go at researching yourself. I've sort of put mark scheme points and everything on this thing here, but I'd recommend having a look online, having a look at some videos of it. There's not really enough time to cover it in this session. It's only quite a small part anyway. But you know, if we've got time, perhaps we'll talk about that in the last session that we have. But embryo screening is basically links to inherited disorders. It's a way of seeing, have a look at an embryo, which is when the sperm's fertilized with an egg and that's started to grow a little bit and it's going to develop into a fetus and into a baby. So before that's developed, we have a look at that embryo and we see whether it's got an inherited disorder, so whether it's got a defective allele. And then what we do is we take the embryos, which are normal with good alleles, and we then implant those back into the woman, and that will then develop into a baby without that disorder. So it's good because it means, say, for example, we're screening for cystic fibrosis, it means that we're able to, if a parents were carriers for the cystic fibrosis gene and they didn't want their child to have cystic fibrosis, they could undergo embryo screening and therefore avoid having it, which is really good. Now, you need to really know about the issues surrounding it, the advantages and the disadvantages. So the disadvantages is that it's expensive to carry out, and it might damage the embryo and lead to a miscarriage. It might also harm the mother. And now, these are our 3 best points that I would put in the exam, guaranteed to get you a mark. The ones that are a little bit more iffy that I have seen on mark schemes, and these are all mark scheme points, by the way, it's all very well understanding what it is, but when it comes down to it, you need to be checking those mark schemes and you need to be learning the points that come up in the mark schemes to do well. So for embryo screening, another problem is that it might promote prejudice. So is it suggesting that those with genetic disorders actually are unwanted? Could it lead to designer babies? So where, well, if we're able to screen for inherited disorders, could we screen for particular traits? That's a bit of an iffy point though, but it does sometimes come up. And it means that we have to make decisions about terminating a pregnancy. If we've realized that our embryos does have this defective allele, we're going to say we don't go ahead of this with this pregnancy, which obviously is a bit of an ethical issue. However, the good things is that it's going to alleviate suffering. If we're stopping someone having something like cystic fibrosis, then that's a good thing. And that also reduces the healthcare costs associated with treating the disorder. So it's sort of a balance between, well, yes, it costs to do embryo screening, but if it's going to save the NHS money in treating those disorders in the long term, then is that a good thing? And it gives people the choices to make these decisions. Okay, so I see we've got a question. What is a miscarriage? Miscarriage is when the pregnancy fails and then you would lose the baby. So obviously there are risks with doing this embryo screening because it's quite an invasive procedure. Okay, so I know there's a lot of points there. Don't necessarily worry about writing them all down. If you want to, I don't know, take a screenshot of it, or if you want to come back to this video and pause it on this point, then you can have a look at that after. Okay, but I've not got time to sort of pause on this slide for ages. I'll give you 20 seconds or so and I'll have to see if I can answer any questions in the meantime. If you've got any questions about anything that we've done so far, then feel free to send them in the chat now. How do you spread it if you're a carrier? So going back to our inherited disorders then, if you're a carrier for that, remember your cells, so you have one copy, so you have 2 copies of each chromosome, 1 copy of the chromosome with the recessive allele, meaning you're a carrier, okay? And if your gametes will then to have that chromosome with the recessive allele, then you would pass it on to your child. Is this combined or triple? This is both. This is in both combined and triple science. Are we going through the specification? Yeah, I'll show you which part of the specification we're going through. We're looking at 4.6.1.6, genetic inheritance. We're going through all of this stuff. Okay, so you can have a look at that and cross-reference after. So if we have big B, little b genotype in our gamete cells, would some have big B, some have little b? Yeah, exactly. You've understood that. Do we have to know multiple inherited disorders or just 3? The only inherited disorders that you need to know about are cystic fibrosis and polydactyly. That is for AQA. Like I said, if you do another exam board, you need to go to your exam board specification. You need to see which inherited disorders it tells you to know about. Do you have to memorise the issues for embryonic screening, or will some of them be given in the test to refer to? Quite often you are given a passage with some sort of an example. And we'll have a look at that when we do our exam technique session. But I would, you know, have a go at memorising these. Is this topic covered in AQA and Edexcel and other exam boards? Yes, it is. You should have learnt these terms. Is blue eyes always recessive? I don't know. I've just given that as an example. I think blue eyes is recessive, yeah. If cystic fibrosis runs through mum's side of the family, but dad, for example, doesn't have it, do you have a higher chance of getting cystic fibrosis? Well, it depends if the dad is the carrier or not. You only have a chance of getting it if mum is a carrier and dad is a carrier. Okay, right, I'm going to move on now. I'll answer any more questions at the end. Okay, so I've got an exam question for us to practice. So figure 1 shows a human body cell in which part contains the chromosomes. And can anyone tell me what the name of that part is actually called? Good, well done those of you who put A. So this is the nucleus and that contains our chromosomes. Humans have pairs of chromosomes in their body cells. Draw one line from each type of cell to the number of chromosomes that it contains. So how many does a human body cell contain and how many does a sperm cell contain? Okay, well done everyone who said 46 for the human body cell, and the sperm cell would be 23. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at the inheritance of sex. So you might have heard of this already. Females, we have the chromosomes XX, and males have the chromosomes XY. Okay, so we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and we normally just number them up to 1 to 22. And in the 23rd set, instead of having numbers, we call them X and Y chromosomes. It doesn't represent what they actually look like. We just call them X and Y chromosomes. Okay. So give the genotype of the male offspring. Actually, no, before that, circle the part of figure 2 that shows an egg cell. So which would that be? Where am I circling? Which would show what the egg would be? So a part of figure 2 that shows an egg could be this, could be any of these. The key idea here is that an egg is where the gametes are fertilized, so it's going to have 2 copies. Any of those. Give the genotype of the male offspring. What would that be? Good, so the male offspring would be XY. Remember, genotype is the alleles present. A man and a woman have 2 sons. The woman is pregnant with a third child. What is the chance that this child will also be a boy? What do we think? And this question does often trick people out, but well done all of you who are saying 50%. So there is always, probability is just a probability. It doesn't mean that, just because if someone had 10 girls and 1 boy doesn't mean that there's any different chance. It's still, every time they have another child, it's still going to be 50%. So that one does often catch people out. Okay, we've got another question now. Let's just check. Oh, I didn't copy over the whole of this question. Okay, let's just start it. In humans, hair color is an inherited characteristic. Red hair is caused by a recessive allele. When does a recessive allele control the development of characteristic? So which box is it? Is it 1, 2, or 3? Good, so it would be when the dominant allele is not present. Figure 1 shows the inheritance of hair color in one family. So this is something that you need to be able to understand. These are called, the name's gone from me, the family trees. Okay, so this is a family tree. And what we can see here with family trees, we tend to represent males with a box and females with a circle, and we color depending what characteristic they have. So this doesn't represent what genotypes they have, what genes they have. This represents what physical characteristic they have. So it's more representing their phenotypes. So we can see here, this is the mum, this is the dad, and this is the mum. And they both have brown hair, and they come together, and their children, they've got 3 children, and each of those, so we've got a male with red hair, we've got a male with brown hair, and we've got a female with red hair. So brown hair is caused by a dominant allele, big B, and red hair is caused by the recessive allele, little b. What combinations of alleles does person 1 have? So if it's a male with brown hair, so we know it must be one of these, but which one would it be? I can see we've got a mix here. Is it 2 big B's or a big B, little b? Now, the way to work this out, okay, when we have 2 different options, we have to have a look at what offspring they've had. So because they've had an offspring they've had a child with red hair, that means that they must have carried that recessive allele for red hair, because this one must have inherited a little b from mum and a little b from dad. So actually we know the genotypes of both parents must be big B, little b. So this would be our answer. Person 3 married a woman with brown hair. Figure 2 shows how brown hair. I've cut off the rest of this question. Let's go to this and copy it over. Where was it? Just screenshot that and put it on 1 second. It's not letting me. Let's have a look at it on here. Won't let me paste it over. So if person 3 married a woman with brown hair, figure 2 shows how hair color could be inherited by their children. Complete figure 2 to show the combination of alleles that the children would inherit. One has been done for you. So again, so go through each of these. So we've got big B, little b. So this one here, what would this be? This would be 2 little b's. Then we would have big B, little b, and then we'd have 2 little b's. What is the probability that one of the children would have red hair? So we can see here that red hair would be this one and this one. So it would be 50%, okay? 1 and 2, 50%, same thing. Okay, cool. So I think what we'll do now is we will have a go at the Kahoot quiz. So I think I've got about 10 questions. So I will put the pin up again. First names only, I'll be removing anyone else. So our pin is 7670932. So if you go to kahoot.it or if you download the Kahoot app. Okay, once we've got a few of you on here, then we will have a go. I'll just give you 1 minute to get on there. Feel free to ask me any questions while we're just waiting for everyone to join. Okay, 10 seconds left for the rest of you to join and then we'll get started. Okay, right, I'm gonna get started now, but if you haven't joined, you should still be able to join as we go. Okay. So question 1, how many pairs of chromosomes do humans have? Remember, key word here is pairs. So hopefully I'm really getting that point, drilling that into you now. Is it 23, 21, 46 or 42? Okay, good. Well done, those of you who said 23. Those of you who put 46, remember we do have 46 chromosomes with 23 pairs, okay? If I asked you how many pairs of shoes do you had, and you had 2 shoes, you wouldn't say you've got 4. You would have 4 shoes in total, but you'd have 2 pairs of shoes, right? Exactly the same thing. What is an allele? Is it a different version of a gene, a chromosome, a gamete, or an enzyme? So we did also have this question at the end of last session. Well done, really, really good. 133 of you, most of you there, so different version of a gene. So those of you who said chromosomes, remember chromosome is what contains all of our DNA, okay? And it has genes on it. A gamete is the sex cell which will inherit some genes. Okay, what is a recessive allele? Is it only expressed if 1 copy is present, always expressed, or only if 2 copies are present? Okay, brilliant. So it's only expressed if 2 copies are present. Okay, remember we need, it's recessive, so we can't have any dominant allele present. Only expressed if 2 copies are present. Good way you could remember it actually is recessive. We go back to this. Recessive has got 2 S's in it. So you could remember it needs 2 copies. I don't know, I just thought of that on the spot, but that's a way that you could remember it. Okay, what type of allele causes polydactyly? Is it a dominant allele or a recessive allele? Okay, well done, those of you who remembered that. So polydactyly is caused by a dominant allele. And again, you could remember that because polydactyly has got a D in it, and D for dominant. And cystic fibrosis has got an R in it, R for recessive. So I've just told you the answer for the next one. So if we don't get 100% on this, I'm sure now I've said that there are going to be a few of you who deliberately picked the wrong one. Yeah, as predicted. Okay, cystic fibrosis is caused by a recessive allele. A dominant allele would be represented as what? Would it be a capital letter or, no, I wrote small letter, I should have said lowercase letter. Good, so it'd be represented as a capital letter. Well done, most of you got that. What is cystic fibrosis? Can we remember that? Is it where we have extra fingers or toes? Is it disorder of the cell membranes, or is it colour blindness? Have you been paying attention? Good, so cystic fibrosis is the disorder of the cell membranes. And can anyone tell me in the chat, so what are our sort of symptoms of fibrosis and why? So disorder of the cell membranes, what does that cause to build up? Good, so that causes mucus, thick mucus to build up, which causes difficulty breathing and also difficulty with digestion. Okay, should we always carry out embryo screening? Is that true or false? Good, false. So the reason, and this links into when you start to have a look at the exam questions to do with embryo screening, quite often you have to weigh things up. They'll give you some information about the disease that we're screening for, and we have to weigh up the costs and the benefits. So we've seen a couple of questions to do with cystic fibrosis and polydactyly. Cystic fibrosis, it would be quite good to clear out embryo screening because that is the symptoms of that are quite bad, and also it costs the NHS quite a lot. Polydactyly is just having extra fingers or toes. That's not going to cost the NHS really anything, and so it's not necessarily worth it. Obviously it's a personal decision, but it's about weighing it up. Okay, true or false? In males, the sex chromosomes are the same. So in males we have XX. Oh, I said this last time. I was like, I'm always worried that I put the wrong answer. I meant to tick false, so I've messed everything up now, haven't I? I meant to put false. So those of you who got it wrong got it right. So that's going to mix things up. So we're going to have to take the, sorry about that. Oops. Okay, well, you know that if you get 9 out of 10 right, then you actually got 100%. Okay, big B, little b is heterozygous. Is that true or false? I'm worrying now. Did I put the right answer on this one? Good, true. So remember, hetero means different. So these scoreboards isn't going to mean anything now because see if you got 10 out of 10, you got 9 out of 10. But well done, those of you anyway. Whether you got 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10, you've done really well. Okay, so we'll leave that there. Cool. Right, so if we go back to our learning outcomes then, so you should be able to explain all these terms, should be able to use Punnett square, should be able to describe these 2 inherited disorders, and we've had a little look at discussing the advantages and disadvantages of embryo screening. So let's just go back to our sort of schedule for the week then. So we've now done reproduction in the genome yesterday. Remember, if you've missed that or if you want to go over that, that's available for you to watch, as is genetic inheritance will now be available after this to watch on, I think, on YouTube. And then also what we have to look at tomorrow will be variation and evolution. So we'll be looking a little bit more about why we vary, why different characteristics vary. We'll have a look at natural selection and a little look about evolution as well. And then on Thursday, same time, we'll be looking at classification. And then content-wise, that should be most things done, and then we'll have a look at exam technique on Friday. So we will be practicing more questions related to that today on Friday. But I would recommend after this, if you wanted to have a look at this, like have a look at some more exam questions in your own time, and then if you come to Friday's session, you've been having a go at some exam questions and you realise that you were struggling with particular bits, and I can sort of answer any questions that you have. So we've got 5 or so minutes left. So I think what we'll do is just have a little look through the sorts of exam questions that come up and just go through those with you. So we'll see, they tend to be quite similar. So, in this one, for example, it's to do with polydactyly. It's told us in this case that it's caused by a dominant allele. The man is heterozygous to polydactyly. Explain how the information above shows that the man is heterozygous for polydactyly. Okay, now the information above is that the man's mother has polydactyly, but the father does not. So we have to show the examiner in this instance that we know what heterozygous means. So that heterozygous means that we have 1 dominant and 1 recessive. So we have 2 different alleles. Okay, so we can see that because the man's mother has it, that must be where he's inherited that dominant allele. But because the father doesn't have it, therefore the father must have recessive allele, so he must have inherited a recessive allele from the father, which shows that he must be heterozygous. And we can see our mark scheme there. We just have to see he's inherited it from the mum, and 1 mark for saying that he's inherited the recessive allele from the dad. the man marries a woman who does not have polydactyly. What is the probability that their first child will have polydactyly? Again, so you just need to draw out a genetic diagram as we've done. If you draw that all out, you see that it'll be 50%. And you'll see generally these all seem to be very similar. So not going to bother going through any more. We'll just go through one more of those on Friday just to refresh on that and to check that you're all okay with it. I find generally that once you've got your head around it, once you've nailed doing the genetic diagram once, you should generally be okay with doing them all of the time. Again, see another question here. Very, very similar to what we saw this time with the family tree. Tends to be a lot to do with probabilities. One thing that I probably should have added to the learning objectives actually is to be able to describe how sex is inherited, so that females are XX and males are XY. So yeah, I think we will stop there in terms of content. So I'll just give you a minute or so if you've got any questions to send them in the chat now, and we will finish off with those. Other than that, I guess I'm looking forward to seeing all of you tomorrow. Where can you find past papers like these? You should just be able to find exam questions by topic online, or your school should be able to give you to them. So I have Exam Pro because I'm a teacher, and that's what your teachers have. So your teachers should have that as well, where they can get lots of exam questions by topic for you. What are some mnemonics and associations that I would use for this lesson? So that's a very good question, actually. I think they're not necessarily mnemonics or associations, but sort of breaking the words down. I'd say definitely for the cystic fibrosis and for the polydactyly, I would use the fact that polydactyly has got a D in it for dominant and cystic fibrosis has got an R in it for recessive. And yes, those of you who haven't got any questions, feel free to leave now. That's fine. What happens when a person have two different eye colours? That would be something different altogether. I don't know the genetics behind that, but it obviously would be some sort of mutation somewhere, some different allele. Why does polydactyly need a recessive allele if it's caused by a dominant allele? So polydactyly doesn't need a recessive allele. All it needs is a dominant allele. It might have two dominant alleles, but it just needs a dominant allele, okay? Right, I think that's all our questions. So thank you so much, all of you, for coming. Lovely to have you here, and hopefully you sort of understood what was going on today. Yeah, have a lovely rest of your day, and I will see you all tomorrow for our variation and evolution session. Bye.